Simon Leys, one of my favorite writers, once said, "Usually people do not see, they only recognize, and what they do not recognize remains invisible to them." I'd like to talk about what I see when I see leopards. Perhaps it will make some things visible to you, and I hope you'll comment with what you see and help make other things visible to me. So there are three leopards I'll discuss. The first is the book that begets the other two. It was written by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa and published in 1958, a year after he died. Lampedusa was from an aristocratic family, and he held two titles. He was the 11th Prince of Lampedusa, and he was also the 12th Duke of Palma. He had an intense love for literature and for languages, but writing came to him later in life, and he wrote Il Gattopardo, his only novel, in the last years of his life. This novel takes place over half a century in Sicily, from 1860 to 1910. And this was a time of great political and social reordering. The novel follows an aristocratic family navigating their way through these times. The central character, Don Fabrizio, also known as the Prince of Salina, also known as the Leopard, was supposedly based on Lampedusa's great-grandfather. And while this novel was rejected by publishers during his lifetime, it was published posthumously to extraordinary success, going through 52 editions in half a year. The second leopard I'll discuss is the 1963 film by Luchino Visconti, starring Burt Lancaster, Alain Delon, and Claudia Cardinale. Visconti was also from an aristocratic family, though from Milan in the north. He was a count, his father was a duke, and La Scala was the family theater. The third leopard is the Netflix miniseries that came out in 2025. It was created by Richard Warlaw and Tom Shanklin and stars Kim Rossi Stewart, Benedetta Porcaroli, and Saul Nani. It's unclear if any aristocrats were involved in the making of the series. And while diving into the world of aristocrats may not sound like much fun in these very inequitable times, I believe there's a lot of value in following the Prince of Salina, that it can be very rewarding, like following Prince Hamlet. But if afterwards you're looking for a little balance away from the palaces and balls, I'm currently reading Luke Kemp's Goliath's Curse, and it is a really startling view of human history for hundreds of thousands of years, very attentive to the 99%. I highly recommend it. So let's start with a word about the title, Il Gattopardo. There is actually another word in Italian that means the leopard, Il Leopardo. And so Il Gattopardo actually means, translates to the serval or ocelot. And ocelot is an interesting word because it is also the scientific genus of the ocelot is the Leopardus. Ocelot also comes from an Aztec word, which happens to refer to jaguar. To make things even more confusing, the French call the film Le Guépard, which means cheetah. So what do we know? We're dealing with a cat of some degree of size and wildness here. And I think the translators have done a good job with going with leopard. It just sounds great. Lampedusa supposedly preferred the sound of Gattopardo to Leopardo. And so if sound can guide Lampedusa, it can guide us as well. The book is arranged in 8 chapters. And so what I thought we would do is just take each chapter in turn. I'll give a brief summary of the chapter and share some quotes. Then I'll discuss how the 2 adaptations dealt with the material in that chapter. For some of these chapters, it'll take a while, for example, for the first chapter, but for others, it'll fly by, especially since there are 2 chapters that weren't adapted by either dramatization. I was a little disappointed by this because I was hoping the miniseries would have time to go into these wonderful scenes, but unfortunately they did not. All right, let's dive into chapter 1. As advertised, it is an introduction to the prince, and we find him in Villa Salina. He's leading the daily recital of the rosary, and all the family and a number of servants are gathered around, and they're all participating. And during this very Christian ritual, Lampedusa describes the old painted gods surrounding them in the room. He gives them a very active emotional life. And so right away, we have 2 really important elements of the novel come into play. First is the struggle between the old and the new. Here are the old gods and the new gods. Lampedusa says in the novel that after this half hour of rosary, the old gods They knew that for the next 23 and a half hours, they would be lords of the villa once again. The second element of the novel we see is the simultaneity of story. You see the family engaged in the rosary while the old gods are playing out their own drama. And this is a big part of how the novel operates. Many stories happening at once, and from time to time they bump up against each other. What's funny is that after the prince, the next character introduced to us is not a family member, but the prince's dog, Bendico. And Bendico will come up a lot in the novel. Next introduced is the prince's Jesuit priest, Father Pirone. Of the Selina family, we meet Princess Stella, his wife, and together they have 7 children. And the 2 who will see the most action in this novel are his daughter Concetta and his oldest son and heir Paolo. We learn that due to some recent violent outbreaks, the daughters have returned home from the convent. Here in his household, we see that the prince has complete control. We also learn some interesting things about the prince. For example, he's an accomplished astronomer. He's discovered 2 small planets, and he named them Selina and Speedy. The first after his main estate, and the other after a shooting dog. So it's already obvious Lampedusa has a great love for dogs. I heard that all his dogs were named after Shakespeare characters. Now, I hate to say it, but we're only 3 pages into the novel. Lampedusa is a very efficient writer, and unfortunately, I'm a very inefficient speaker. But here, 3 pages in, he shows us the overwhelming mindset that will govern the prince throughout the novel. Between the pride and intellectuality of his mother and the sensuality and irresponsibility of his father, poor Prince Fabrizio lived in perpetual discontent under his Jove-like frown, watching the ruin of his own class and his own inheritance without ever making, still less wanting to make, any move towards saving it. So all the traits of mother and father will come into play later in the story. It shows that the nobles inherit a view of life as much as genetics. And while I disagree with this statement that Don Fabrizio won't make any move towards saving his class, this feeling of resignation to larger forces, it does overwhelm the prince. And we can't understand his actions without recognizing this. He knows he's lost, even as he might negotiate for some minor victory or feel obliged to play out his role. He knows that the world no longer belongs to him. The prince steps out into his garden, and in full bloom are roses he had transported from Paris. And this leads him to remember a less pleasant smell, the decay of a body of a wounded soldier who had recently wandered onto his property and died. Rousseau the agent had discovered this object, turned it over, covered his face with his red handkerchief, thrust the guts back into the gaping stomach with some twigs, and then covered the wound with the blue flaps of the cloak, spitting continuously with disgust meanwhile, not right on, but very near the body. And all this with meticulous care. Those swine stink even when they're dead. It had been the only epitaph to that derelict death. So this is the first direct intrusion of the fighting into their lives. And it comes in a gruesome, individual way. This passage shows how really efficient Lampedusa's writing is. He can show many perspectives at once. For example, there's Rousseau's harsh attitude. There's the visual shock for anyone confronting the body. And there's a real compassion for this lonely death. Don Fabrizio ruminates on what this soldier died for. Now, was it for the king? But which king? There's an older, more competent one that recently died, or there's this newer king. The prince remembers his audience with the old king, where in these memories we see how very good the prince is, a real master at maneuvering the conversation. He knows when to make a salacious joke, when the king is seeking a political opinion or some political intelligence from him. The prince knows how to sidestep that. In one particular conversation with the king, we hear mention for the first time of Tancredi Falconeri, the prince's nephew. And the dialogue goes like this. The king says, "They tell me you've some odd friends in Palermo. That nephew of yours, Falconeri. Why don't you knock some sense into him?" "But your majesty, Tancredi thinks of nothing but women and cards." So what's happening here is the king is referring to Tancredi getting involved with rebels against the crown. Don Fabrizio, he feigns ignorance, and the king is not happy about that. So Tancredi is the prince's impoverished nephew, and he loves this young man over any of his own sons, shows him favor over his own sons. And of course, he knows what Tancredi's been up to. And he's had to visit certain officials to kind of keep him out of serious trouble. But he finds that this tact with the king is probably the most sensible approach, to pretend that he still holds, the memory of the older Tancredi that didn't have any of these political interests. But in the prince's eyes, Tancredi can do no wrong. Speaking of doing wrong, that evening, the prince, he travels into Palermo to go see his mistress. His wife Stella objects, because the streets are very dangerous. They're full of soldiers and hooligans. But the prince goes anyway, and he drags Father Perrone with him. It's a very bold move. So the next morning, as the prince is shaving, he sees the figure of his nephew appear in the shaving mirror. And this is a really wonderful image. You can see how he sees Tancredi as a younger version of himself. You see the connection in this mirror between them. And he asks, "Well, Tancredi, where were you last night?" "Good morning, Nanko. Where was I?" "Oh, just out with friends. An innocent night. Not like a certain person I know who went down to Palermo for some fun." So Tancredi there is referring to the fact that the prince went to Palermo to go see his mistress. Tancredi is probably the only person who can get away with teasing the prince like this. And the prince not only permits it, but seems to like it. Their banter continues until Tancredi brings up a more serious subject and announces that he's leaving to fight for the rebels. The prince calls the rebels mafia men and says that a Falconeri should be with the king. To which Tancredi replies, "For the king, yes, of course, but which king?" The lad had one of those sudden serious moods, which made him so mysterious and so endearing. "Unless we ourselves take a hand now, they'll foist a republic on us. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. Do you understand?" And of course, the prince understands. There is this pressure for social change that needs a real outlet. And Tancredi wants to be part of that process so that he will have a voice in that change and can shape it, in his eyes, more into an evolution rather than revolution. That evolution being how things will kind of stay the same. So Tancredi is engaging with the world and fighting for his place in it in a way the prince no longer can. This moment reaffirms the prince's belief that Tancredi will go far. And before Tancredi leaves, the prince slips him a pocket full of gold pieces. Tancredi laughs and teases him for now subsidizing the revolution. And then for a while, there's business for the prince. The prince meets with his accountant to go over books for his estates. He meets with Russo, one of his agents and dependents. He's a member of this class that's on its way up as the aristocracy declines. And there are many other little dynamics in their relationship that are very interesting. For example, 3 months ago, Russo had stolen 300 baskets of lemons from one of the prince's estates. The prince knew, and Russo knew that the prince knew, but they don't talk about it. The prince also knows that Russo is secretly part of a group that's trying to buy one of his estates, but they don't talk about it. This was a country of arrangements. There's this tacit understanding that as long as things still functioned, you can live with the devil you know. And the devil must keep up their end. They know not to take things too far. 400 baskets of lemons, then we might have a problem. But at 300, they have an understanding, and they don't need to talk about these things. The only thing they do talk about in this case is that the prince asks Russo and his friends to take a part in defending Villa Salina if necessary, if the violence comes close. The prince then goes to his observatory, where he finds Father Perrone. And Father Perrone asks him, referring to the liaison from last night, "Is your excellency coming to confession?" The prince, whose sleep that night and conversations that morning had driven the episode of the previous night from his mind, looked amazed. "Confession? It's not Saturday." Then he remembered and smiled. "Really, Father, there wouldn't even be need, would there? You know it all already." This insistence on his enforced complicity irritated the Jesuit. "Excellency, the efficacy of confession not only consists in telling our sins, but in being sorry for them." What I love about this exchange is that while Father Perrone serves the Salina household, he's not a sycophant. He takes his spiritual role really seriously, and to the extent he can, he'll push back on the prince. They can talk politics, fairly honestly and openly, and he's a true companion to the prince. They're also partners in the astronomy work. In real life, Lampedusa's great-grandfather, who was an inspiration for the prince, was also an astronomer. But that astronomer was a bit of a fool. And he also had a Jesuit priest, and that priest seemed to have done all the real work. This fictional account is more of a partnership and is much richer. So at lunch that day, the prince sees that no one's really worried about Tancredi, except Concetta, who was the only one with a shadow on her pretty forehead. The girl must have her eye on the young scamp. They make a fine couple, but I fear Tancredi will have to aim higher, by which of course I mean lower. Already we see that the prince understands that Tancredi's political ambitions will need money. The prince's estate, split among his 7 children, and Tancredi will not be able to fund those ambitions. So Tancredi will have to marry into one of these new rising families, gathering these, untold amounts of wealth. But for the moment, the prince just wants to allay his daughter's fears for Tancredi's safety. So he starts talking about the ineffectiveness of royal muskets. It's a very small kindness, but it does seem to console Concetta. After lunch, the prince's eldest son and his heir Paolo comes to see him. I wanted to ask you, Papa, how are we to behave with Tancredi when we next meet him? The prince understood at once and felt a twinge of annoyance. What do you mean? Has anything changed? But Papa, you can't possibly approve. He's gone to join those swine who are making trouble all over Sicily. Things like that just aren't done. So Paolo's position here is what you might expect the generic view of the nobility to be. Since they are the system the rebels are looking to overthrow, it makes sense that, they would be staunchly against the rebels. But as we've seen, the Leopard's realistic view of the world sees beyond this reflex. And while he'll tolerate political jousting with Tancredi and Father Perrone, he won't from his own son. So his response is vicious, saying that he'll take Tancredi's actions over his son's idleness any day. He says that anything Paolo will have in the future will come from Tancredi's initiative. Paolo leaves this encounter very shaken. And now the time has come again for Rosary. And the chapter ends with the same words of the Rosary by which it began. And this is a beautiful form for the chapter to take. It shows this regular rhythm of life. And it is this rhythm of life that Garibaldi and his troops will increasingly encroach upon. So let's see how the 2 dramatizations treat chapter 1. The Netflix miniseries begins with titles. The first is the date. That's fair enough. The book does the same. Then come more titles. And this is understandable. They're trying to give some political context. But one problem I have with this is that even a very basic description of politics is a political position and possibly a political distortion. For example, multiple titles here refer to a north-south divide. And that definitely is one element at play. But within the South, we've already seen many, many divergent perspectives. I mean, even within the Villa Salina, we see many divergent perspectives. The Bourbon kings are mentioned in these titles, and we've already seen that, well, with these 2 most recent Bourbon kings, they inspired very different sentiments from people. And the revolutionaries have their own king. Also, the simplification of politics seems very antithetical to how the novel, The Leopard, operates. And its great strength, really, is this deep understanding of political forces and tendencies that really transcends the specific situation in Sicily. For example, the novel is hugely popular in Japan, where many know almost nothing about Italian unification. So I'm not convinced these titles are particularly helpful or necessary. Now, the novel's aficionados may note that the date in the title here is April 1860, rather than the May 1860 of the novel. And that's because the miniseries starts with an event that's referred to in the past in the novel, and that's taking the girls out of the convent and bringing them back home. Now, the novel mentions the girls, all the daughters, but the miniseries reduces this to just Concetta. So we're going to get Concetta out of the convent. Before getting to the convent, the carriage is stopped by these soldiers. So the prince must get out of the carriage. We catch a glimpse of who he's traveling with, and there's Father Perrone and Bendico. And I'm very happy to see Bendico so soon, but I'm a little confused about the breed and why it's been changed. He was clearly identified as a Great Dane in the novel, and here we have an Irish wolfhound. It seems the casting has gone woke. The prince intimidates the soldiers, and so they let him pass. And after they get Concetta from the convent, they pass by the same point again on their way back, and apparently there's been fighting and destruction, and now there's these fires burning. They hear cries for help, so the prince gets out of the carriage. His companions protest, but the prince says no, he must get out. And he must get out to watch this soldier come running to him, and then watch the soldier get beaten by this gang. And then, okay, he's good to go now. So there are a couple things here that don't really make sense to me. The prince's behavior here is one. I don't quite understand why he gets out, what he's watching for, why he does nothing else. And it's kind of dangerous ground when you have a central character who is insisting on an action so early on that you can't quite follow. I'm also surprised that there are these serious conflicts happening at night. It's not impossible, but generally I would expect that they make camp at night and that they fight during the day. In the novel, when the prince goes into Palermo to see his mistress, Father Prone points out the bonfires of the rebels along the surrounding mountainside where they've made camp for the night. But more important than all of this, what is the impact of starting the miniseries here, on the road, as opposed to at home? It seems innocuous enough. You know, you're playing out an event that was described in the novel. Even if the fleshing out of it can be a little baffling in the prince's behavior. But I think what this does is it upends one of the really effective structures of the novel, which is starting with the family and then letting outside events break through bit by bit. If we start seeing the leopard with complete command of his household and then seeing it diminish as there's these other things he can't control. I like how the idea of fighting comes in concept first, you know, whether it's in newspapers, letters, or gossip, before it has real physical manifestations before them. But if you put these soldiers immediately in front of them, if you have all these fires and violence right away, you don't have that progression anymore. And these progressions give the violence more meaningful weight. And it gives the world that violence disturbs more meaningful weight. After retrieving Concetta from the convent and witnessing a beating, the next scene in the mini-series is their arrival at Villa Selina. Revealing Villa Selina also happens to be the first scene in the Visconti movie. So what I'd like to do is show parts of both of them side by side. But before I do, I'm going to need to discuss a little about which version of the Visconti film I'm going to be showing you. And I don't mean whether it's the longer Italian version or the shorter American version. What I mean is a question of aspect ratio, negative area, and color. So this is going to be a quick technical detour, and then we'll be on our way. So there are two Blu-rays I have of the Leopard. The first is the Criterion edition. The second is a French Blu-ray that's often referred to as the Fox edition. Here is an image from the movie of the prince in his observatory. And you'll see the two versions of the Blu-ray appear here at the same height, but you'll notice that the top image is narrower than the bottom one. And this ratio of width to image height is what's referred to as aspect ratio. At the top, we have an aspect ratio of 2.21, so it's 2.21 times wider than it is tall, and the bottom has an aspect ratio of 2.55. The Leopard was shot on a format called Super Technorama 70. And as I understand it, the European and American cameras for this process had slightly different apertures. So that means that they would expose slightly different areas on the original negative. The film was shot with anamorphic lenses, and so unsqueezing that would widen this aspect ratio. And when you take all these differences into account, I've heard a range of talk that implies an unsqueezed original aspect ratio or original filmed aspect ratio of maybe 2.25 or 2.43 or 2.55. I apologize, I don't have the expertise to verify exactly what it is, but this is the range of the scuttlebutt. And that's the original photographed aspect ratio. As far as exhibition aspect ratio goes, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that a 70 millimeter print was ever screened or made. So it would seem that the exhibition aspect ratio was most likely 2.35, somewhere between the two examples we see in the images here. So if we look at these images, we see that the bottom 2.55 version, it makes more use of the negative. There's picture we see in the bottom that we don't see in the top panel. For example, on the left, instead of that picture frame getting cut off, we see the whole left frame and then quite a bit of wall beyond it. On the right, the bottom image also gets us all the way to the edge of the window, and you can see just a little more of that right telescope leg. Now, for those of you with really good eyes, you'll also see that the bottom image does lose a tiny bit from the top and bottom of frame relative to the top image. But this loss is very slight relative to these very big gains it gets on left and right of frame. So next, let's talk about position. Both of these images are centered on your screen, but you'll notice that the print is a little more to the left in the top image. And that's because more of the left part of the frame has been cropped out than the right part of the frame to achieve this 2.21 aspect ratio. And this degree of left crop changes shot to shot. For example, here's another moment from the movie, and you see that here it's a little more extreme how much has been cut off of the left. And it changes the compositional character of this image. The lower image, you see, it's a little more balanced left and right, whereas the upper image has a short side on the left where more image has been cropped off. So let's go back to the observatory scene and look at color this time. You'll notice that the top image has more overall warmth than the bottom image. This bottom image, it's more neutral, whites appear white. And my understanding of why there's more warmth in the Criterion restoration is that it came at the suggestion of the cinematographer, who suggested emphasizing the yellow as that was an important part of the production look. This is largely based on forum chatter, so take this with a grain of salt. But if that is the case, I generally don't think such things should be done to alter films after the fact. It's true, yellow is an important part of the production look, but it's already there in the film. So this all leads me to want to use the Fox version for this video. You see more picture, composition, it's not subject to these varying crop decisions, and the color is more balanced and not intentionally altered. Also, I'm going to put a piece of the frame side by side here for you, and you can see how the left version also seems to fall apart in detail relative to the right. Another argument for using the Fox version. So that's what I'll do. I also think that for an English-speaking audience, the Fox version may be a novelty, as this Blu-ray doesn't come with English subtitles. If English is all you speak, you likely won't be watching this, so you'll get a little dose of it now. Great, so let's go back to the promised arrival scene at Villa Selina, and here are some slices of that scene from the miniseries. So they're riding up, there's a nice archway with the leopard. You get a sense of scale of the grounds with these multiple archways. Then they walk up to the main building. Closer in gives you a human scale of the place. So let's look at snippets from the Visconti introduction of the villa. And these are over opening credits since it's the very beginning of the movie. We get this nice move up from the trees to see the main building. Then a different view with statuary. A view showing an approach is very nice, as if we were approaching in a carriage. And we're closer now where we can appreciate this lovely light on the building. A nice terrace where the size of the chairs shows a scale. Then a move closer in to an open window. Then a transition inside using the curtain to connect the two shots. And it's a beautiful transition to interior lighting. So let's loop these for a while and just see what differences we see. The color balance is different between the two images. The top is universally cheated warm, so that I never see anything that's actually white. There is a brightness and clarity to the bottom image, and that this just makes everything easier to see, including detail. In the top image, the camera never stops moving. It moves in the language of swooping camera movements that we're pretty used to seeing. They're meant to convey some grandness. But in the bottom image, the movements are gentler. They're movements of discovery, and they're interspersed with static camera shots where the subject is allowed to speak for itself, where its grandness speaks for itself. I also think there's something very original and poetic in the progression of approach in the Visconti film. And it also leads us into the very first scene in the novel, the Rosary. In the miniseries, a rosary scene doesn't appear until the middle of the first episode, and it's used for a pretty sacrilegious purpose. So I'm going to hold for a moment on these last frames of the sequences that we've been looking at. It may seem like an odd comparison to make, But I think looking at these two frames actually encapsulates many of the differences in aesthetic paradigm between these two projects. So looking at the top image, we see that it uses heavy diffusion to soften the image. There's a lot of different instruments you can use for diffusion, and the technique can be used for any number of reasons. Diffusion is often used to give the image a romantic or dreamy feel, or to give it a historical texture, which I think it's being employed for here. When it's used with subtlety or selectively, I think it'd be very effective. But when it's used with a heavy hand, and the upper image is a heavy hand, and when it's used for 6 hours, what it does is it can make your world very abstract and very unanchored from detail. Under certain lighting conditions, it can also do a lot to blur large sections of the image. We'll see later on how it can lead people to look animated or like AI. You'll also notice in the upper image the light flare that's exaggerated with heavy diffusion. And this is the default aesthetic for much of the miniseries. Windows frequently are blown out and flare. This level of diffusion with flare means that you don't just lose the information in the light source. The spill of the flare strips out information from all parts of the picture. For example, here you can't see Father Perone's face at all, and the prince's face is fighting the flare for attention. So next, let's look at the color range, and you'll see how narrow it is in the top image. There are no white points or blue points. Everything is yellow. The grass is yellow. The salt and pepper hair is yellow. This is an abstraction, and it, in my opinion, thins out the world. In the bottom panel, warm colors still dominate the production design, but there's space. There's space for whites and even some cool spots and blue tones. It's a world with much more range. So next, let's look at the depth of focus. To the extent that you can see anything in focus with that diffusion, the top image clearly has the background out of focus. Looking at the lower image, you see deep focus, which means that we can see here in the foreground Father Perone, as well as in the background all of the details of all those paintings. I mentioned before how one of the very important aspects of the novel is this simultaneity of different experiences and perspectives. And what deep focus allows is for us to witness this simultaneity. You know, we look at this image and you can follow the path of any of those characters in the shot. They'll have very different emotional paths through this scene, and we can choose whichever one of them we want to follow, and many of them exist at the same time. The top image directs how you should feel. The lower image lets you choose. It lets you walk through and observe the environment. In the top image, you're more meant to just float through this more conceptual, abstract environment. So let's get back now to some adaptation choices. I'm going to start with the Visconti because it's closest to the novel and it's also the most compact. So this is where we were, reciting the Rosary, and we get news of the fighting, including that Garibaldi has landed with troops at Marsala. And see how in this composition, you can see how central and important the prince is in this household. And you can also follow each person's personal reaction to the news. Through the window, we're able to see green of vegetation and even a slight shape of the mountain outside. So there is a lot going on in this, and we can see a lot of the world, including all the people and their unique perspectives. So with this news, the prince decides to send his eldest son, Paolo, to look after the house in Palermo. And the prince's wife she's just distraught because of the danger this puts Paolo in. And look at this production design. Just the density of detail on every single surface in every dimension. It is really hard to achieve this kind of fullness in production design that overwhelms you, but not with chaos. And if you look at the range, for example, if you look at the color range, pink is kind of the canvas for the shot, but it will stretch into moments of purple and red. The golds form this almost circular frame around the image. And you have punctuation that's in these blues and greens that are surprisingly harmonious with the rest of the image. It's probably not a surprise to hear that Visconti began his career as a set dresser, and we are definitely the beneficiaries of that in this film. With his wife's dramatics, the prince loses patience and he tells the servants to get his carriage ready. Everyone knows that this means he'll be going to see his mistress. Now look how beautiful this location is. Now let's look at it next to the staircase we saw in the miniseries, which is also a beautiful location. But look how intricately the greenery is designed against the house in the bottom image. The bottom image also plays as a static composition that just lets you feel the grandeur. Remember, we were moving around with that staircase in the other shot on top. You'll also notice servants in the bottom image, many servants. And the Visconti film is much more attentive to the range of servants that would be attending the nobles in various settings. As a member of the nobility, he would have had very specific memories and a frame of reference for that. Anyway, the prince tells Father Perrone, "You're coming with me." And then the prince has this dramatic exit. I mean, just look at this depth. You can lose count of how many rooms you're walking through. And you even get the greenery at the exterior through the window. So the shot just goes on and on and on. As the prince leaves, he gets a look at the dead soldier in the garden. And just look at that. And like they say, every frame a painting. As they travel to town, the scene between the prince and Father Perrone plays out in this really wonderful two-shot, where they both have some weight in the frame. Yes, the prince is a little higher, but they're still balanced in their way. And this goes for their relationship too. The dynamic between the two plays out as richly as it does in the novel. They're stopped at a checkpoint, and it's relatively uneventful. But remember that with all the talk of troops fighting, this is the first time we see live soldiers, and that has an impact. So the situation can play out with tension without having to deliver another dramatic event. That tension and the unknown is enough of an event. Notice here that there's this use of shallower focus than we've seen. And because we haven't seen it, it has a real effect on us. When it's used with discretion, we get a psychological heightening from this. And I think that's very intentional for the tension in this scene. If every shot were like this, we wouldn't have noticed a thing. But because it's unusual, it has an impact. This is the street where the prince goes to visit his mistress. We'll see throughout the story that the prince moves through these high and low places. And there is so much I love about this shot. Every surface just has so much texture. The ground alone seems to have a dozen different textures. I love the variety in the light temperatures. You have these really subtle shades of cool and warm, each its own thing. And together, they don't feel like a fruit salad. They feel like life. I also love that the image is not a single choice between bright or dark. Brightness and darkness are tools that can be deployed in many different ways and in many different parts of the frame. I want to put up a frame of the same mistress's street from the miniseries. So the shot is mysterious and interesting, but it's abstract. It's telling us a mood rather than what it would be like if we were actually on that street. And note that these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. The bottom image, it has detail and it has mood. The top, just mood. Also note that the top does something very common in contemporary color correct, which is that it uses this orange and teal lighting in opposition. Again, compare that to how much more subtle this patchwork of cool and warm light are in the bottom image. Now it's the next day, and remember that wonderful shaving scene that was in the book? Well, we get to see it play out. And here's the introduction of the prince's nephew, Tancredi. And that connection in the mirror shows us how they are versions of each other, reflected across time. It's a really wonderful technique. It's an example of when the novel writes a beautiful image for you, and all you have to do is realize it. And the scene plays out with all the warmth and good humor that you have in the book. We see the prince actually enjoy being teased about his outing last night to see his mistress. We see the really effortless winning personality of Tancredi. And I love that reflection of Tancredi on the wall. It's like he already belongs in the pantheon of revered family members. And you see this deep tenderness between the two of them, even as they challenge each other, even as Tancredi is setting out on this risky path. So Tancredi says goodbye to his uncle. I love how playful he is with Bendico, who absolutely loves him. He says goodbye to all his cousins. He's literally being dashing, the very picture of youth and activity. He says a warm goodbye to Concetta, but nothing overly familiar, and he's off. And so now the family goes to see him off, and just look at the floor of that terrace. And I love this image. It's beautiful in its own right, but it's also what Tancredi might see if he were to turn and look back. There's one more image I need to share that's not from the movie. It's a behind-the-scenes photo of Alain Delon and the dog playing Bendico. Visconti really gave Bendico the care the character deserved. He's not just a prop to appear in scenes. Bendico loves Tancredi in the novel, and it's just amazing how well this registers in the movie. And with animals, that love has to be real. After Tancredi leaves, we go to the observatory, where the conversation between the prince and Father Perrone plays out. And it plays out with all the push and pull and nuance that you have in the novel. So I'd like to point out one thing about these single shots of the two men. And note that it's not just a face. In these shots, you see deep context. You know their desk and their work style. You see that Father Perrone takes tea as he works. Looking at this, I can have a detailed memory of the place as if I were there. So this is where the Visconti film ends with its adaptation of Chapter 1. The film so far has run about 25 minutes. It's a really tight adaptation, and it hasn't really added significant new material. The Netflix miniseries, it takes an entire episode, about an hour, to do the same adaptation. This is because it's added a number of scenes and storylines. So let's take a look at what it's done. So recall that Concetta has just come home from the convent, and we sit down to a breakfast meal. And here something happens that happens a lot in this series that confuses me. It's morning, we have this bright sunny room with light flooding in, and for some reason, every candle in the place is lit. I don't understand, but we'll move on. The talk at the table is political. Paolo, the prince's son, seems very worried, but the prince expects nothing to happen. Or so he says. It would seem he might be putting on a brave face here to calm the family, as the night before he's already witnessed a lot of violence. And less the content of the conversation at breakfast, I want to focus more here on the aesthetics of how we see the people at the table. Here we see one of the daughters in a focus construction that's very narrow. And the problem with this kind of narrow, limited focus is that as people move through it, a perplexing set of things comes into focus in a way that makes little sense for directing the eye. For example, here, her ribbons are in focus, her hand on the right side of frame, and maybe that lip of pearls around the bowl. Why? Here, the prince's face isn't in focus, but his neckwear is, maybe the back of his chair, and for some inexplicable reason, the plant arrangement on the left of frame. Here, people exist on this tiny focus plane, and the effect is that they almost look like cutouts. Poor Father Perrone looks like he's against the zoom background. Gone is the deep context. I'm not meant to observe him operating in his surroundings. He's pulled out of his surroundings. One other thing to note is that when you color correct with a wash over everything, you can easily start slipping into other colors. If you don't have this neutral point to keep you honest, you can just become unanchored. So a yellow wash can turn green before you know it, and that priest's collar is green. So the next day, Concetta is out wandering, and here I give the series great credit for a lovely location that shows the greenery interacting with the architecture. And she happens upon Tancredi, and this is how Tancredi is introduced to us. And this is unfortunate. Recall how Tancredi is introduced in the novel and film. He's the future, and the connection is to the leopard. In the miniseries, he is a carnal object, and his connection is to Concetta. And with that, the miniseries has chosen its path. Unless you think I'm exaggerating by calling him a carnal object, later during the rosary, Concetta looks up, sees a buttock, and thinks of Tancredi. Later, she draws, you guessed it. What happens is that she and Tancredi have a talk about politics in which he confesses to her he is going off to fight. In exchange for her not telling her father, she makes Tancredi promise to write to her. We then get scenes of Tancredi yelling, firing haphazardly at many night battles, and writing 2-word letters to Concetta. We then get the scene where the soldier dies at the Salina villa. The only reason for placing the scene here seems to make Concetta worry whether the soldier is Tancredi. And it is not Tancredi. And it is not a painting. The incident stirs up Paolo, and we get the scene where he speaks out against Tancredi, and it does not go well. The incident also stirs up Concetta to spill her secrets to her father. She tells him that she's very worried because the letters from Tancredi have stopped. The prince sets out and finds Tancredi imprisoned by the teal-orange color scheme. Color aside, this is a really nice composition. I wish I could see more of the detail, as it looks like a really lovely set with wonderful textures. Tancredi seems to think there's nothing wrong, but the prince informs him that he is to be executed the next morning, but the prince will do what he can to prevent it. So let's stop here for a moment and consider what's happened. We're half an hour into the episode before the prince and Tancredi share their first scene. It is under circumstances that show no warmth, no humor, only confrontation and tension. Their connection is the core of the novel. It gives the prince the last drops of his purpose and action in life. The Tancredi we're presented here seems like a boy, not unlike any other boy. The prince treats him less as a favored son than just another son he has to discipline. There's none of the permissiveness. And more importantly, there's not a reason for that permissiveness. Tancredi is supposed to be this winning character, bubbling over with youth and charm and intelligence. Later on, the prince goes to visit his mistress, and he tells her the story about how Tancredi's father spent all their money and left him with nothing. But he describes how Tancredi has always been exceptional. The problem is that in the miniseries, we don't observe this Tancredi. And the prince merely saying that he is exceptional doesn't make it so. In the movie, in just a few seconds of bidding his cousins goodbye, we see a vigorous, uncommon force in Alain Delon's Tancredi. This other Tancredi, not even Bendico is interested in. The next day, the prince goes to see the governor about Tancredi. The prince tries to talk down the seriousness of the situation. The governor, however, chalks up the gravity of the moment and talks about the need to set an example. He then offers the prince the consolation of having a prime seat to the execution. Now, this is forced, villainous talk. A politician has no need to gratuitously antagonize a powerful person like that. But then the leopard does something that's even more ridiculous. He holds up a checkbook and asks the governor to name his price. Here, the leopard suffers from a rioting disease that I call first day on Earth syndrome. The leopard woke up today for his first day on Earth, realized he was rich, and says, "Hey, I can give you money." The leopard that does not suffer from this disease would know that his wealth is known, with or without a checkbook. And this healthy leopard would know that you don't start negotiations with a blank check. This healthy leopard would know how to dance around the topic and to slowly learn what does the governor need and how could he assist with this. But this is a sick leopard at the table who is crass and graceless at navigating political conversations. This is the opposite of the leopard of foresight and political sophistication and discretion that we see in the novel. The leopard of the novel always succeeds. Though he chooses his battles sparingly, he always succeeds. And this sick leopard loses every negotiating move here and ends up giving away an estate to save Tancredi. Let's talk about that estate, Argivocale. Recall that we were talking about an estate in the novel where the prince knew Russo had stolen from him those many baskets of lemons. And Russo knew that he knew, but both said nothing. Recall, this was a country of arrangements. Well, in the miniseries, the prince accuses Russo of the stealing outright and publicly humiliates him in front of the other workers. And this is completely contrary to how the world operates in the book. And this public humiliation is going to make an enemy of him for life. It was someone's first day on Earth, and they woke to find someone stealing from them, and they realized they had power to humiliate them, and so they did. It was the most immature and counterproductive use of that power. My harshest criticisms so far have been for these two scenes with the leopard. They're scenes that don't appear in the book, scenes that have been invented for the series. But whether the scenes are invented or not means nothing. What is meaningful is their total effect. What do we gain and what do we lose from their presence? We gain a kind of dramatic moment, but we lose the sophistication of the leopard. His experience and worldview, the very character of the leopard, the very reason that the book exists. And giving up the character, giving up all this to attain just a little dramatic moment is a crime. It's a crime if you really care to learn about humans and how they operate. I'll give another example, this from a different adaptation, of how adding an action can completely undo a character. In 2006, this film came out called Away from Her. It was an adaptation of an Alice Munro short story that first appeared in The New Yorker called The Bear Came Over the Mountain. The short story is about a married couple, Fiona and Grant. And with the onset of Fiona's Alzheimer's, they decide to move her into a nursing home. Now, this nursing home has a rule that new residents cannot have visitors for 30 days. And they say this is to give them a fair chance of adjusting to their new life. Hard as it is, Grant follows this rule, and after 30 days comes to visit Fiona. At first, it's not clear if she remembers him. Then it does become clear that she's formed a close relationship with one of the other male residents. The nurses tell him, oh, this is common, not to worry about it, it's just a phase. But as his visits continue, it becomes clearer to him that Fiona does not remember any of their life together, and that her relationship with this man, Aubrey, is getting more and more serious. One day, Grant finds Fiona and Aubrey absolutely distraught. And the reason is that Aubrey's going to be leaving the nursing home soon to return to his wife. What is really extraordinary about Grant in this story is that he never once disturbs his wife's world to tell her who he is. He even goes to the lengths of appealing to Aubrey's wife to bring him back to the nursing home so that Aubrey and Fiona can be together. Now, Grant isn't a saint. He may be doing this partly out of a sense of guilt for his past affairs, but in the shock of these new circumstances, it is extraordinary the decisions Grant makes for the sake of Fiona, the key of which is not to disturb her present happiness with their past life. That's the short story. In the film, there is an added scene where Grant confronts Fiona and says, "I'm your husband." And even given how disturbed she is by this statement, he proceeds to tell her about their life together. Who would do that to Julie Christie? What is the point of the story then? The person who found the strength to hold back this information was extraordinary and interesting enough to follow. If you lose that, then you lose the story. And so the movie sacrificed the character for this little dramatic moment. Back to the leopard. So after having given up an estate, his dignity, and his personality, the prince fetches Tancredi from jail and has him cleaned up. Apparently, this is so he can take him to watch the execution of his former comrades. It's very hard for me to understand what he hopes to achieve by this. If Tancredi were somehow innocent and inexperienced, then maybe this dose of reality would have a sobering effect. But remember, Tancredi has already seen many battles, and presumably many deaths. And wouldn't witnessing this kind of martyrdom just spur him on? And to add to this confusing moment, this is the extent of Tancredi's reaction to seeing his comrades executed. After a happy return to Villa Selina, Tancredi tells Concetta that he must leave to join his comrades. The prince finds out, manages to find him, and in their heated conversation even raises a gun to him. Tancredi then says the famous lines that, for everything to stay the same, everything must change. The prince tosses him some gold. Let's take stock of these events. The episode of the execution confuses a relationship that was already off track. This leopard treats this Tancredi as a wayward son that needs corrective, as opposed to a favored son who he sees himself in. In the novel, part of what the prince sees reflected in Tancredi is a very practical political analysis. Let's look at that quote from the book again. Tancredi's line right before the well-known ones is that, unless we ourselves take a hand now, they'll foist a republic on us. This is not blind idealism. It's very shrewd and forward-thinking, very practical. This whole conversation is included in the Visconti movie. It doesn't take long because the thoughts move quickly. The leopard and Tancredi, they're not saying or thinking through these ideas for the first time. Their lines aren't these banners that take their sweet time to unfurl. They are thinking through how to maneuver into the future. And Tancredi has the talent and the energy for it. These conversations give the leopard more and more faith that Tancredi is the future representative for the noble class. He's going to be different than the past, but this is the creature that will survive in this new world. The miniseries does not include the rest of this conversation. The famous lines are stripped of their context. And they are Frankensteined in to a conversation that has borrowed lines from all sorts of other conversations throughout the novel, equally devoid of context. And what it makes in this hodgepodge is a Tancredi and a Prince that are just at philosophical loggerheads. And this philosophical stubbornness is the exact opposite of who they are in the novel. And in the novel, it is this lack of philosophical stubbornness that actually leads them to success. What they have in common is a deep understanding of the world. In this miniseries, Tancredi and the Prince do end up reflecting each other in the most unfortunate way that it seems neither is a particularly thorough thinker. For both, it is their first day on Earth, and they are both all reflexes and cries.